Hello, my name is Benjamin Schurz, and welcome to another webinar with the Hill for Literacy. At the Hill for Literacy, we strive to create a world of readers, and for over 20 years, the Hill has been committed to supporting teachers and leaders in education to bring evidence-based practices into schools. Just a little housekeeping. If you have any question during today's webinar, please submit them through the Q&A button, and we will be able to answer your questions at the end after Dr. Truckenmiller's presentation. And we're also going to be sharing today's slides in an email with everyone and anyone that registered. So now I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Adrea Truckenmiller, today's guest, to our webinar series. Dr. Truckenmiller is an associate professor of special education and school psychology at Michigan State University. Her research seeks to make students' development in reading, writing, and language visible and improve educators' access to evidence-based instruction. She's principal investigator of The Writing Architect, a tool that highlights 5 high-leverage components of writing and connects to research-based instructional practices. She also co-created the MTSS Master's in Certificate program at Michigan State University to coach leaders in schools to implement more effective instruction. Welcome, Adrea. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Ben. I'm delighted to be here and happy everybody was able to make it this afternoon. This talk, I have to say, Ben, was inspired by our conversation in thinking about implementation of best practices in literacy, particularly around reading and writing. And you really got me thinking about some of the big takeaways. So I'm going to talk today about 10 assumptions that I initially, throughout my career, had gotten wrong and had to rethink and really dive deep and go learn other places. So I'm going to go through 10 of these assumptions that I had that now I'm digging much deeper into. So starting out with multi-tiered systems of support. So thinking about multi-tiered systems of support is this integration of assessment and instruction as our framework for how we implement more effective practices in reading and writing. And so I had been trained in 2010, prior to 2010, trained in multi-tiered systems of support. And I was working in schools trying to implement multi-tiered systems of support, particularly from the positive behavior interventions side of things. So I had learned how to apply it in the behavior aspect, but when I came to do it in the reading world, I realized I had a lot more to learn. And luckily, in 2012 to 2016, I went to the Florida Center for Reading Research and worked on a bunch of projects there and learned a lot more about reading in particular. But one of I'll walk through this, the MTSS process as I had thought it was just straightforward. In reading it in my book, I'm like, oh, this makes tons of sense. But then when I was in the school, as I imagine many of you have experienced this, that it's not as simple as saying, okay, at Tier 1, we need to implement high quality instructional materials. Let's make sure those are happening. There's a lot of considerations involved with that I'll talk about. Some of the big ones that I saw. And then we're all going to use a brief screener. We're going to use a CBM style brief screener, or lots of people use a computer adaptive screener. Some say use one or the other, some say use both. I'll talk a little bit about that. Then we have to make decisions based on that screener about our high quality instructional materials at Tier 1. And then we have to make decisions about who gets a Tier 2 intervention. And, straightforward, it says in the MTSS process, you give those students who are below benchmark a standard protocol intervention. That's an effective process. But what standard protocol intervention? They're not all made equally. And how do we choose those? Then we are going to be monitoring those Tier 2 interventions with progress monitoring. But the frequency with which we monitor and what assessments are we monitoring with, we need some more research and have some some practical questions around that. And then when students are not progressing in a well-chosen intervention, we want to know why, and we might administer some diagnostic assessments. But diagnostic assessments, which ones you use, depend very highly on what content you're measuring. So it's going to be very different for math versus reading decoding versus reading comprehension versus writing. And then we have wonderful guidance at the Tier 3 level from the National Center for Intensive Intervention and from people like Lynn Fuchs, who talks about the intensification taxonomy. So our research really is very, very, very strong at this Tier 3 intervention level. But to get people to that level, we want to make sure we're only providing that level of intervention to the students who really need it the most. And what I'm seeing the most in my work in schools across the past 15 years is we need to tighten up that Tier 1 curriculum, the reading screening, and the Tier 2 intervention pieces. And so I'm going to walk through a couple things that really struck me that relate to this. MTSS is not being content agnostic. We really have to have deep expertise in the development of reading, in the development of math, in the development of writing, in the development of language comprehension, whatever aspect of the system that we're addressing. We really have to understand the assessment and intervention intricacies of that particular area. And so something that's been striking me is the difference in reading instruction that's needed for different components of reading. So I had thought, if a school picked their comprehensive reading curriculum, it's going to work just fine for all components of reading. But that's not quite right. And we see this in pendulum swings in schools, and we see this push and pull on particularly the differences between teaching code and teaching meaning of reading. So, for example, lots of states have said you cannot use the 3 cueing system to teach word decoding. And the 3 cueing system meaning using context or pictures to guess what the word says. And that's right, that we don't want to use that method for decoding the word, for reading that word aloud, for matching the letters in that word to the oral language sounds that we hear. However, teaching kids to interpret the meaning of a word from context and from using multimedia like pictures and videos are actually an evidence-based practice for teaching the meaning of the word. And so we have this really, really, really important nuance that is helpful to really understand. And it comes from having different backgrounds, like coming to reading. If you are trained in how to decode words, you know about using explicit and systematic instruction on matching the sounds that you hear, the words that you hear, with the letters on the page. Whereas if you're trained in other ways, you're more familiar with how to teach the meaning of words. Or if you're working with older kids where the code doesn't matter as much, you're very familiar with how to teach the meaning of words. And so it's important to have that distinction. The next assumptions that these previous ones lead to is that if we have an evidence-based instructional program at Tier 1 or Tier 2, we think that it should work. So if we pick a standard protocol, Tier 2 intervention, or we pick this good Tier 1 curriculum, it should work for all components. But as I dove deeper into research studies on the effectiveness of Tier 1 curriculum, say things like CKLA or EL education, some of these knowledge building curricula, I found that the evidence really shows it works really well for knowledge building, but hasn't necessarily been tested for its effectiveness with code, development of code. It's not to say it wouldn't work, but we just don't know. It hasn't been tested on that. And there's probably other things that work a little bit better on those things. And so at the tier 2 intervention level, I had mentioned with this MTSS model, when we're picking tier 2 intervention for students, we need to implement a standard protocol intervention. Well, which one? And which one really depends on the target of the instruction. And so I went to the What Works Clearinghouse and I looked for all of the interventions that I could find on reading in the What Works Clearinghouse. And my team and I downloaded all of the interventions from the What Works Clearinghouse and where those interventions had an impact. Like, what component of reading did it have an impact on? And so you're not able to really read the interventions on this chart, but I want to rather orient you to the concept of what we did here, which was we pulled down all of the interventions. So really cool things like sound partners and UFly and text structure instruction, which is now called the knowledge acquisition and transformation strategy. Things like PALS on here. And we looked at, did those interventions, what did they have an impact on? Did they have an impact on phonological awareness? Did they have an impact on phonics and spelling? Did they have an impact on fluency? Did they have an impact on vocabulary? Did they have an impact on other language comprehension components? And so you'll see with each of these columns, we marked which interventions have an impact on which things. And so, there's some that have a good impact on, say, vocabulary, like Read 180, but not necessarily on the other components that we might be interested in. And then I have a table of just 3 programs as of 2020 that had been reviewed by What Works Clearinghouse also, that had an impact on both the code side of instruction, so phonics and spelling and fluency, and the language side, vocabulary effects. So this to me pointed out, okay, we do have to be pretty particular about what intervention, what outcome, what component of reading we are talking about when we have our standard protocol tier 2 intervention or interventions. And if we have these different practices that have impacts on code versus language, or knowledge building in the case of our tier 1 curriculum, that means we need assessment to sort students towards the intervention, or to change our tier 1 curriculum and what to change in our tier 1 curriculum. So that means we need assessment to measure that. And so that brings me to this, in our MTSS system, this tier 1 screening of, okay, we need to assess how students are doing in reading. And we typically use a curriculum-based measure like DIBELS, Acadian, CCCBM, FastBridge. Or we might use a computer adaptive assessment like STAR, NWEA, iReady. And what are those actually measuring? What is that telling us? Is that going to tell us what we need in our tier 1 curriculum? Is this to change, to beef up? Is that going to tell us what we need in our interventions for which kids? And so I dove pretty deep into quite a few different questions about screening assessment. And I looked at what schools are doing. So I found that a lot of schools that I worked with saw the drawbacks of their curriculum-based measure as a screener or the drawbacks of their computer adaptive assessment as their screener. And so they were administering both, multiple assessments at the screening level. So I worked with a school district and we took all of the scores that they had for their third grade students, all of their CBM scores, their curriculum-based measure scores. We used Acadians. And I took their computer adaptive assessment, which was the STAR assessment. And we looked at how well those two working together or separately predicted their state test performance in third grade. And we actually found that if that school had used either measure by itself, they would have missed a bunch of kids. So we put their two scores together to see what the school could do with the two scores together. So let me walk you through this decision tree that we ended up finding. So what we found when we ran this analysis, we ran an analysis called a classification and regression tree analysis, where we put in their Acadian score and their STAR scores. And we found that the STAR in third grade did really well at differentiating this group of at-risk kids who were below benchmark in their reading achievement. But it missed a big chunk of kids. It missed 14 out of the 110 kids in their third grade. And it missed those kids likely because these are students who had good listening comprehension, good language comprehension, and did all right on the STAR, but their word reading fluency, their code, was lower, and it was inhibiting them from doing well in reading at the end of the year. And so these students, we needed to identify those students as well, and they're likely the word reading code needs. And then the students who performed lower on the STAR probably had a combination of code and language comprehension needs. And the results could have been, different as well. It could have identified, okay, we're missing a bunch of kids by just using the CBM measure, the Acadians measure, that the STAR would have picked up as well. But this is what our analysis showed. And this analysis that we found is actually really well supported by other research saying that we need both a code measure and a language comprehension measure because of this differentiation of instruction and this differentiation of needs. And so let me show you that evidence. I was lucky enough when I was at the Florida Center for Reading Research, this was 2012 to 2016, I was running several studies for Dr. Barbara Foreman and Yakov Petcher, where we were measuring every single component of reading that we could possibly measure. We had hundreds of students that we tested on these two areas. And we tested kids in grades pre-K through 12. And in this graph, I show you the results, some of the results of grades 1 through 10. And what we're showing in this graph is, of course, the grade levels across the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, I'm showing you the percent variance in reading comprehension in this overall reading achievement, reading comprehension construct. How much of that achievement in reading comprehension is explained by the code portion of reading? How much is explained by the language comprehension portion of reading? And how much is shared between the two combined. And so what we find, of course, is that decoding and language comprehension are not as separate as they are in our instruction. Their students' abilities in that area, it's mostly shared variance, which are these horizontal lines in the bars. But then you see, of course, code has its own unique prediction, especially in grades, in the earlier grade levels in elementary school. And then that disappears once students become fluent in their decoding abilities. And then that's when the language comprehension takes over and the shared variance between decoding and language. So this is further pretty strong evidence from the science showing us that we need to measure both of these things within our MTSS model, because both of these things have developmental implications for students as well as different instructional implications that I showed earlier. So this makes our MTSS model of how do we use this screener data, this makes it a little bit more complicated than just what we typically see in an MTSS model. This means we need some more direction on which data points to use for what. And so I started thinking about this and digging and digging and digging, and came up with a framework of how to guide data teams to use different data points for different decisions. And so I wrote this up in an article that's in the Reading Teacher. It's here. And when you get the slides, the link for this article is in the slides. And this is a free article that you can use and download and use it with your team to ask very specific questions of your screener to make sure that you're lining up code instruction and language comprehension instruction and beefing up your tier 1 curriculum for those particular things. The other tricky thing that muddies the waters on making these types of decisions, these very specific individual decisions, is the number of commercial products that are being sold to people. There's so many products that have been historically used over time, and other ones on the market that it's hard to know which ones are the best ones to use for which of these decisions. And so I talk about in this article which types of data points to use for which decisions. But that article was published in 2024. I mean, it was recent, but I didn't get all of the assessments in there. So in 2025, the state of Connecticut actually commissioned me and my team to do a more thorough review of which data points out there, which assessment suites out there have evidence that can be used for these specific decisions. And so we lay it out in several tables in this review of assessments. And so I've linked that one there for you too, in case your school is looking for a new assessment or wondering if your particular assessment system or subtests have evidence for informing those specific decisions that you're looking at. And so that's also freely available online, and I have a link to that too if your school is doing that. Okay, what was my next thing? Oh, so my background is as a school psychologist, and had lots of great training and background in curriculum-based measures and focusing on reading. But as I was seeing this really, really important role of language comprehension, realizing I need to go learn some more things about language comprehension, because if we want to make an impact on students' reading abilities, we cannot ignore language comprehension. And in schools and in my training, it felt like, okay, this is the expertise of speech language pathologists. It absolutely still is the expertise of speech language pathologists. But we also need to learn more about it and do more about it, because this is part of the place where students are going to get the most out of learning language comprehension is going to be in their classrooms with their regular ed teachers. It's going to be with the special ed teachers for those students who have developmental language disorder or dysgraphia or other areas where they need and would benefit from language comprehension. We saw in that graph earlier that all students need development in language comprehension, and it's occurring in every single subject. So it's not just our general ed English language arts teachers, it's also our social studies teachers, science teachers, math teachers, health teachers. And if you think about it, it's happening in every single classroom all day long. So in every classroom, we're listening to the teacher talk. We're listening to our peers talk. We're speaking to our teachers and our peers. We're reading about science. We're reading about social studies. We're writing what we find in our science experiment. All of this is occurring in every class. So this language comprehension piece is so much more universal than what our systems partition it out to be. And our systems tend to partition it to this particular speech language pathologist person. So I think this is a really great opportunity for us to really work with our speech language colleagues to learn more, all of us, and continue learning. And the reason why I found some awesome evidence too for integrating more language comprehension into regular ed tier 1 curriculum and tier 2 interventions that are focused on other things. And so I worked with this school who was nice enough to give me their reading screening data. This school uses a measure of vocabulary in their reading screening. So every fall, winter, and spring, they're administering a vocabulary assessment and a comprehension assessment alongside of their curriculum-based assessment to monitor decoding. And they have good instructional practices in place for their decoding. And then they decided, hey, we need to integrate some more effective, good language comprehension-based practices into our tier 1 because most of our students are below benchmark in vocabulary. So we need it in our tier 1 system, as well as our tier 2 interventions. And so they got this free intervention free language comprehension practice called Let's Know. And what Let's Know does is it has lots of repetition for vocabulary, distributed practice with vocabulary, simplifying sentences, trying to reduce the cognitive load of activities in the classroom to focus on the content. And so this particular school, I'm showing their reading screening data. You can see the distribution of scores in the fall is in gray. And you can see the benchmark in this green bar, the benchmark for vocabulary for second grade. It was right about here. And you can see that most of the students in the fall were far, far below that benchmark. But then after this integration of this language comprehension in their tier 1 and tier 2, you can see how much in this blue distribution is the spring data, how much they moved up by having that integrated. And so to me, this was really amazing evidence of how language comprehension can be built into your MTSS system. And then the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of assumptions is getting this stuff into place. So getting that language comprehension pieces into place, getting for those schools who are still working on getting good code instruction at tier 1 and tier 2 and measuring code in your screener. It takes a lot of professional development, and it takes really good curricular materials available. And so this is something that I learned from my most recent study. Ben mentioned that my big project right now is the writing architect. So I'm working on writing instruction because we need it so much. And the biggest challenge that I found being in 50 classrooms over the past 3 years was I had assumed we would have time to do some professional learning for the teachers during professional learning communities, for example. But it turns out that that's not a common practice of having this professional learning time. There's so many barriers to schools. It wasn't their fault, but definitely lots of barriers to work on in getting that professional learning time. I also found the curricula, even if it was considered a high quality instructional materials, I haven't found a single one that's rated highly that actually includes enough explicit instruction in spelling, in sentence writing, in text structure. Also was not providing enough opportunities for students to practice and get feedback. For the writing part, there was not enough prompts or projects defined in the particular materials. So this highlighted to me where we have some directions to go and things to work on, and highlighted again to me where I need to start learning more. So something that I'm working on learning more, and I know something Ben is working on at Hill and has talked about a lot, is looking at something called implementation science. So the science of taking the science of reading, science of writing, the things that work, and putting them into practice and looking for the barriers and facilitators. And two of those things that really highlighted for me was the professional learning time and the curricular materials are huge places of opportunity where hopefully we can keep working on that. So I'm gonna put up the summary of our assumptions here. If I can get to it. And I'm going to turn it over to Ben to ask some questions. If I can get to this line.
Hi, Adria.
Hi, Ben.
Well, thank you so much. I think that your description of your own journey in terms of your understanding of MTSS, where you started at least, mirrors a lot of people's. Kind of where we all started, right? Which is, we know we want our students to do better. We know that we live and work and operate in these complex systems. And many of us are overwhelmed by data, right? And so even though we are told, we're encouraged and supported to look at data, it's sometimes hard to know where to start. And so that's really the first, so I'm thinking about all the things you talked about and where you really started with looking at these data. And I'm thinking about that chart that had the horizontal lines that showed language encoding are intertwined, they're integrated. And what, in your experience, the schools that you're working with, the assessments that you've looked at, like, how do you line that up with the way students are performing in front of the teachers and the students that they're seeing every day, and how can they use that knowledge to think about what they're doing on a daily basis?
Ooh, yeah, that requires a lot of integration while
Yeah,
online, right? Um, yeah, and it's hard to tease apart too when the kids are reading. So let's just take a typical process. A student is reading a passage out loud, and the teacher's kind of following along, listening. Um, and where I think we can disentangle the two pieces, the code and the meaning, is when the student makes an error. And we're pretty good at, with our listening, like marking the errors that the students make. And then we can go back and look how many errors were there for the student in the decoding part. And then we can see, if if there's fewer than 95% words correct, we have an accuracy issue. And you can see that pretty clearly right away. You can see that accuracy issue. A place where you're going to see the meaning coming out is, maybe they do go back and self-correct if they got a word wrong. Because they're monitoring for meaning, and they realized, oh, that word I just said didn't quite work. Let me go back and self-correct that word. So you might see that meaning show up. And then the place where you see a lot of overlap is when kids read with prosody. When they're reading with meaning, you can really feel that integration of they're able to read fluently, and the meaning is making sense as they're reading. Another place where it shows up is access to building your vocabulary and building your content knowledge, is when kids can read fluently and decode. They can pick up so much more on their own. So another practice that's different between the meaning side and the decoding side is independent reading time. I remember making that recommendation of in early elementary classrooms, you need to get rid of that independent reading time, because most of the kids are sitting there not able to read the words, right? They can't decode the words. So using independent reading time is not a good use of time. But there's some really amazing research that shows if you've got some kids in second grade who are already readers, fluent readers, that independent reading time is amazing. It is really good because they're getting so much vocabulary out of that reading time that they might not necessarily get from other activities in the classroom. So that's another highlight of a time where the instructional moves are very different depending. And so if you see a kid during independent reading time, they can't read the words, or you say, hey, why don't you read that first sentence out loud to me? And they get, 2 or 3 errors within the first sentence, that independent reading time is not going to work for them.
And so is there a way to structure for those students that have more advanced fluency, or their accuracy is good and they are doing some independent reading time? Are there structures, systems, ways that you can use that time or structure it for the students that leverages that time to deepen comprehension?
That's a good question that I don't feel confident in my answer to, Ben.
Because I think about the times that I've spent and I think about the implementation science where you were going at the end of your presentation, and that to me is like where the rubber meets the road. And some of what we do at the Hill, I think about reciprocal teaching, right? Like how can we structure that independence time? So instead of just saying, okay, go read your book so I can have more time with these students, saying, okay, read these books, and maybe a few students read a similar book, they do a book club, they have those types of discussion moments or scaffolding. So that's one that I've used that we support. Are there other ones that you've seen or maybe reinforce that the efficacy of that time?
Yeah, reciprocal teaching, we've known since the 80s, number one, great, amazing way to do that. Peer pairing, of course,
Mhm.
awesome. I think about, particularly if students do struggle with language comprehension and with the reading comprehension side of things, for intervention, I like to use collaborative strategic reading. So Jeanette Klingner and Sharon Vaughn, you can go to the Meadows Center website and get collaborative strategic reading protocols to use. That is a phenomenal instructional support.
Great. Thank you for that. And then also the lineup between reading, language, and writing.
My favorite.
Yes, and that was, when we talked earlier, it just seemed like you are onto something really exciting with lining those up and the power of writing and writing analysis. Can you speak a little bit about what you're doing in that regard and what you're finding out about writing and the elements of writing that we can teach and that we can focus on that will support our students?
Yes, this was such a fun journey, Ben. So, uh, like I mentioned, I was at Florida Center for Reading Research. We were working on assessing reading and language. And so we had come up with these measures, and I was like, oh my gosh, this language thing is really underlying the reading, decoding pieces quite a bit. And then I had already been working on writing, and I'd been using CBM metrics in writing. And I was, CBM metrics, curriculum based metrics, did pretty well with measuring production, like the total words the students wrote. It was doing pretty well with accuracy, so like the code side with spelling and sentence accuracy, but it wasn't getting at the ideation and ideas that you need to get out while you're writing. But I've been working on these language pieces in reading, and so I was exploring more. I'm like, what's going on with this language part? So I was asking colleagues and reading and reading and reading and reading about this, and conducting some research. So around that time, 2000, it first showed up in 2017, and then more work in 2019, and the work has just exploded since then from an amazing colleague I previously had at FCRR, Young-Suk Kim. Young-Suk Kim is doing the most outstanding work in connecting reading, writing, and language. And so the data that I'd been collecting on writing and on reading, it just clicked when her model came up. So I encourage everybody to go check out the interactive dynamic literacy model. And so this is based on really advanced empirical data that she's been collecting for a very long time on the relationship between reading and writing and how it's all based in language. So language really supports reading comprehension and writing. And so she has an excellent book that just came out in May that I encourage lots of people to get to. It's called Cultivating the Reader and Writer by Young-Suk Kim. And she walks through the model of reading development, a model of writing development, and then the interaction between the two, and how language is at the base of all of it across them. And so, literally everything I do from here on out is referencing Young's interactive dynamic literacy model. And is based in that and is measuring the components that she highlights. And so she highlights the code side of reading, for example. So decoding a word, and then on the writing side, encoding a word. Both of those are influencing each other. And that's supported by so much other research. There's an amazing meta-analysis of reading interventions for students with dyslexia that show, of course, we need phonics instruction, but then the second biggest thing that's actually improving students with dyslexia's reading decoding is including spelling. And that makes sense when you look at Young's interactive dynamic literacy model, that the two reinforce each other, and actually the spelling reinforces even more the word reading, the word decoding side. And then there's some other awesome intervention studies. Steve Graham does a meta-analysis of these spelling interventions and shows that spelling actually has a huge impact on oral reading fluency, something that we're always measuring and trying to improve. So if we really want to improve reading fluency and reading decoding, I think spelling is a super powerful way to do that.
And I'm assuming when you talk about spelling, it's more than just here's your 10 words and 2 bonus words.
You got it. That's right. So I'm sure you've seen this too in the schools. This is kind of that implementation science thing happening where, okay, everybody's, worried about the Friday spelling list. All they do is memorize the whole word, and it's memorizing like theme words. Like this week is the Halloween words. And so they don't even follow a similar spelling pattern. And they memorize the whole word. They spit it out on the Friday spelling test. The Friday spelling test is too much anxiety for the kids. It's too much, especially students with disabilities. It's too much. So we're seeing it's not working. So we're just going to throw out spelling altogether. And so the solution is not to throw out spelling altogether. They're very right. Like you probably want to get rid of the Friday spelling test issue, but you still have to teach spelling because it's going to reduce those kids' frustration so much if you teach the spelling patterns. And there's a great article by Deborah Reed in 2012 where she gives the argument for how to actually teach spelling and bringing it back, giving your administrators the argument to bring spelling, a different form of spelling instruction back.
Mm-hmm. Is that Deborah Reed in Tennessee?
Yes.
Yeah. I hosted her on the webinar a few months ago.
Oh my gosh, I have to go back and watch that.
Yeah.
She's one of my heroes. I listen to everything Deborah Reed says.
She's fabulous. So if anybody else is watching and wants to go, you can go on our website. She is dynamic in her research on program implementation, and the whole idea that we can't tier 2 our way to tier 1 instruction is just so powerful and impactful. Wow, Adrea, I just enjoy talking with you. It's always, I always learn so much. And I can't wait to learn more about the implementation science work that you're doing and keep up with that. Anything else that you want to share or say to our audience? If there's like one thing kind of that you're hopeful for these days in terms of progress, what would that be?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking that, Ben. I am super hopeful. I've been watching the people who are on this webinar, I know are these people. But then I've seen it all across the state of Michigan. When I moved here in 2016, that really surprised me. And I've just been seeing it more and more and more is educators who are seeking out their own professional learning and going to, I see it a lot at the Reading League. They'll show up at the Reading League. They'll show up at webinars like this. They're listening to podcasts. They're reading journal articles on their own, which I can't even get my PhD students to read journal articles. But there's all these in-service teachers, educators who are wanting to improve their students' literacy and wanting to learn. And so I love that about being in education. I love that we're lifetime learners, that we're always seeking to continue on that journey, learning all that stuff. So that's what makes me hopeful. I think it's really great to see some of this legislation start to keep up, but I think that is only driven by the demand of educators who really are doing it on their own. And so I think we need to keep up with them.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. And we had the Hill hosted a literacy summit during the Sundance Film Festival, and we had Nellie Taylor Sanders, who was a former Secretary of Education in Oklahoma. And she talked about policy a lot. She talked about policy being that floor. It's really the minimum of what we want to expect in our schools to happen. And so I love the idea of landing there, and then also thinking about all these educators, teachers, people who are going further than that, seeking out their own professional development. And then parents, right? And the parents who are learning about reading and literacy and leveraging the understanding that there's something that isn't quite happening for their students that ought to be, and putting some pressure on the system. And so I think I'm excited about all of those pieces coming together, and all of your contributions to it. So that's a wrap for today's webinar. Thank you so much again, Adrea.
Thank you, Ben, for hosting. This was a really fun way to spend an afternoon and have some interesting discussions, and it's really spurring me to keep thinking about what's next in research too. So thank you.
Well, let's keep talking. And thank you. So for everybody who is watching and getting the recording, thank you so much for joining. You can reach me at ben@hillforliteracy.org is my email. And you can also visit our website at hillforliteracy.org. And you can find, if you search webinars, you can find the recording of this webinar there and many others that we have had. So thanks everybody for coming today. And if you have any questions, just reach out. Have a great day. Bye, Adrea.